Hi, good morning. My name is Tim Hofer. I'm the Executive Director of the Empire Center. And I'm so glad to welcome you all to the first ever Governor Hugh L. Carey Policy Forum. We are recording the program, so this would be the right time to either turn your cell phones off or switch them to silent, please. Since 2005, the Empire Center has sponsored conferences and forums on key public policy issues. And we're especially pleased today to begin recognizing the legacy of Governor Carey with this new series of policy forums. We're honored to have with us some members of the Carey family, Nancy Carey Cassidy, Thomas Carey, and two Thomases, sorry, and Thomas Hugh Carey Cassidy. We welcome you and we thank you again for letting us use the governor's name for this series. We very much appreciate it. We also want to express our gratitude to former Lieutenant Governor Richard Ravitch, who provided us with some underwriting support for this event. We could devote an entire forum to Governor Carey's accomplishments, but suffice to say the largest of those and near the top of the list would be his steadfast control of the state budget, especially following 15 years under which the state borrowed and spent wildly beyond its means. And so it's fitting that the first in this policy forum focuses on the state budget, and in particular on the executive budget powers that Governor Carey exercised so steadfastly. In the wake of recent budget cycles and the Court of Appeals decisions in Pataki v. Assembly and Silver v. Pataki, we're asking what we think are some pertinent questions, such as, does the governor wield too much power in the budgeting process? And is it time to change the constitutional rules under which we budget in New York State? Some people, including some of our panelists today, think it is. Others, they'll disagree. Just one. So the format is as follows. Our founder and research director, E.J. McMahon, is going to present the findings of a new paper titled Unbalanced by Design, New York's Strong Executive Budget Process. Then we'll hear from our panel, which will be moderated by Liz Benjamin, a seasoned journalist and the host of Capital Tonight. The segment will end with Liz fielding some questions from the audience, and then we'll hear from Senator Liz Krueger, who will have the closing remarks. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, EJ.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. I want to also thank Nancy Carey Cassidy and the whole Carey family for your assistance in being able to brand this and other events using the name of your father. That we're honored to honor his legacy. I'm going to begin kind of in the middle of the story because I think the most important way to frame the issue of the governor's budget powers and the debate and discussion of whether things have gone too far, in a way, is to focus on Article 7 of the state constitution, particularly sections 1 through 6, which kind of lay out the executive budget framework. And the entire language of that section's on the back page of my paper in your packet. So let's go over the high points, and then we'll talk about how it got here quickly and what the implications are for the future and for the present. The first three sections of Article 7, and these were numbered all in 1938, but came earlier. First is all about the preparation of the budget. The first three are sort of table setters that are not particularly controversial and haven't been. The governor gathers the departmental estimates. This was considered a big step forward at the time because before this all was reformed, there were many more departments. They didn't necessarily report to the governor, and their estimates were gathered by no one in particular, although they were assembled for a time by the comptroller, which was basically the high watermark of the comptroller's role in the budgeting process. Part two is the timing of the executive budget. The budget is got to be annually submitted by the governor. Specifically, it doesn't say the word budget necessarily, as a complete plan of expenditures proposed to be made before the close of the ensuing fiscal year and all monies and revenues estimated to be available therefor, together with an explanation of the basis of such estimates and recommendations. The explanation of the basis is basically the financial plan. That has to be done by February 1st in the year after election, or by the second Tuesday following the start of the legislative session. I'd point out to you, by the way, which I think is a relevant fact, that when this section of the Constitution was drafted, the state fiscal year began July 1st, like most other states do now. We've changed to April 1st in 1943. So the schedule that they had in mind when they drafted this section was a different schedule than we have now. Section 3 had to do with the governor's right and the right of department heads to appear before the legislature. Interestingly, unlike in other states, the legislature can't compel the governor or his representatives to appear. The governor has a right to appear, and department heads have a right to appear. And it shall be the duties of the departments when requested to appear. That's the first 3 sections. Now we get to the meat and to what the source of the arguments is about. Section 4, the legislature may not alter an appropriation bill submitted by the governor except to strike out or reduce items therein. But it may add thereto items of appropriation provided such additions are stated separately and distinctly from the original items of the bill and refer each to a single object or purpose. And further, the bill, when passed by both houses, shall be a law immediately without further action by the governor, except that appropriations for the legislature and the judiciary added to the bills by the legislature shall be subject to the governor's approval. This is basically what describes the control the governor has, the key portion of the control the governor has over the budget, the no alteration clause, as it were. The legislature cannot change the language of the governor's appropriation items in his appropriation bills except to strike out, meaning completely erase, or reduce. This is the crux, all the arguments surround mostly this section, and then the application of the following 2 sections to that section. Section 5, you can't consider a bill making any other appropriation until all appropriation bills submitted by the governor shall have been finally acted upon. And Section 6 contains what the ending of Section 6 in particular contains, the anti-rider clause, as it's called, which says that no provision shall be embraced in any appropriation bill submitted by the governor or in a supplemental bill unless it relates specifically to some particular appropriation in the bill. And any such provision shall be limited in its operation to such appropriation. So you have that language in your packet. You have to keep that very clearly in mind. That's really important, that language. That was really the basis of the most divisive argument in the Court of Appeals in the case we're going to talk about today also. Now, historical framework quickly. This language originated actually and was originally drafted, most of it, almost all of it, in 1915 as part of a constitutional convention in 1915 that went over a lot of issues. The Constitution was called mainly at the behest of a group of reformers who were predominantly Republicans, the progressive Republicans of their time, and some extremely prominent people. You had Elihu Root, who was U.S. Senator, had been a Nobel Prize, shared in Theodore Roosevelt's Nobel Peace Prize as Secretary of State, then had been Secretary of War. You had Henry Stimson, who's still young, Henry Stimson, who had been U.S. Attorney, who had himself been Secretary of War. You had, on the periphery, Seth Low. You had Charles Evans Hughes around, who had been governor already and was going to run for president the next year. These were heavyweights. On the Democratic side, the leading figure by far was Alfred E. Smith, then minority leader of the State Assembly, who had served 11 years, which then, being one-year terms, was 11 terms in the State Assembly from Manhattan. Then in his last term, he had been Speaker and minority leader, depending on the majority. So I want to point out something. I think we're inclined sometimes to look back on what seems like ancient history. This certainly seems ancient, over a century ago, and kind of infantilize it. Think that, well, you know, they were like children compared to now. Things were so simple then. I'd like to suggest to you things were not that different. Politics was politics. This was the burgeoning industrial age state. Al Smith was as savvy and practical a politician as ever lived. Al Smith got behind these very same reforms, the core of them, in 1915, uniting with with a very different group of people, a bunch of patrician Republicans, behind these reforms. And this was somebody who was totally familiar with the legislature, how it worked, and with the legislative mindset. At that point in Al Smith's career, he didn't have a reason to think he'd be governor soon. In fact, he wanted to be mayor, but Boss Murphy decided he should be sheriff instead and make some money. And he also was operating as a politician in a state that he had every reason to believe was going to be competitive for the foreseeable future, for the rest of his life, and was going to have Republican governors possibly as often as not, certainly have Republican legislatures, certainly a Republican Senate. So this was not a political self-interest necessarily. This was him seeing the right way things ought to be done. Constitution's defeated. It was kind of a classic mess. There were a whole lot of stuff in the Constitution. It was put up as an all or nothing proposition. It was kind of like a preview of 1967, if you know what happened then. It's all or nothing. That was actually meant to sabotage it. Al Smith himself ended up voting against it. Tammany didn't want it, et cetera. Al Smith, though, and this is why this is fitting, this is not only the centennial of Hugh Carey's birth, or recently was, a month ago, it's the centennial of the year Al Smith first took office as governor of New York in his first term. He was elected in 1918. He gets elected in 1918. As soon as he takes office, he appoints a committee to revive this reform in particular. This reform and the administrative reform that created all these executive departments we have now and gave us the short ballot. So that's what leads to all this. The case which we're going to decide is the latest in a long series of cases emerging from interpretations of these sections of the Constitution. The administrative reform was enacted in 1925. The constitutional reform was enacted, and what became Article 7 later is enacted in 1927. Franklin Roosevelt is the first governor to submit an executive budget in 1929. Almost immediately, note that I said, this is, I think, a key point. What's the legislature's role here? The governor can veto. He has line item veto. It's deliberately unbalanced. The governor is in the lead. The governor frames. The governor writes the language. But the legislature has a veto of its own. It's that power to strike out or reduce items. I'm beginning to think, having read this and thought about it again for another wave of weeks leading up to this, that Al Smith, at least as far as Al Smith was concerned, that was tongue-in-cheek. Because he knew that legislators are constitutionally averse, small c, to striking out and reducing anything. They just want more. I wanted to get Richard, make sure he was there. But in fact, the legislature spent the next 75 years after this was enacted basically trying to find ways to write language that would circumvent the intent of this language. And that the latest case in that long line was Silver v. Pataki, followed by Pataki v. Assembly, which are the cases at issue today. We're going to discuss those. I'm not going to get into them. I'll make one point that also is striking to me. All of these arguments tend to focus on, and the arguments about what the governor can insert in a budget, and the language of this constitutional section focus on appropriations bills. But of course, we know there's a whole other set of legislation, and they work into this discussion, the so-called Article 7 bills, the language bills, the statutes needed to enact the budget. This is the area that is the cutting edge of, I think, future controversy and present controversy. The size of the Article 7 bill package has expanded rapidly, especially under Governor Cuomo. This year, Governor Cuomo inserted, at least by my count, 80 items in the Article 7 bills that had nothing to do with the budget. Not really. Everything has to do with the budget ultimately. But if I was to read a list of you, which would it would take 10 minutes just to read the list. Amend the rape shield law, end revenge porn, FOIL reform, pretrial justice reform, asset forfeiture, make the property tax cap permanent. See, I'm arguing against interest here. And on and on. All of these items were in Article 7 bills, presented with the budget, and followed with this justification. 3/4 of them had this justification. Quote, enactment of this bill is necessary to implement the fiscal year 2020 budget, which was not true. And the governor, in fact, as I read it, will argue it, had no power to impose that on the legislature, in fact knows it. The legislature could simply, and in fact did in its one House bill, simply deleted most of that stuff, including stuff they agreed with. But I think that's where the future conflict lies. You've got 1,700 pages of Article 7 bill this year, at least 1/2 to 2/3 of which, in terms of raw content, was not budget related. The governor, in 3 places in the budget, this is the future conflict if he ever pushes it. And I'll close here, but I think that it's mentioned in my paper. 3 places in the budget, the governor had language that said, I'm paraphrasing, you need that this appropriation, Board of Elections, Housing Community Renewal, and the MTA capital plan, this appropriation is contingent upon the legislature's enactment of a provision in my Article 7 bill over there. It refers specifically to the bill. This was something he first floated as a strategy in 2015. He didn't push it to the limit. Those provisions were taken out of the final resubmitted bill that was agreed to this year. But that's where the crux of future conflict lies, I think. If the governor ever insists on pushing that right to the limit and saying, no, you've got to vote on the bill that has that language in it, the legislature's choice is going to be basically, I think the most easiest choice, if you were doing it this year, would be to approve it with the appropriations and not approve the Article 7 language, and then see who wants to litigate the issue of whether the appropriation can be spent. But be that as it may, I think that's the future of litigation probably over this issue. I've made a few what I consider sort of modest reform proposals, not meant to be thoroughgoing major budget reform. I don't think Article 7 needs to change. I do think the fiscal year, I didn't used to feel this as strongly as I've come to feel it now. I think the fiscal year should begin on July 1st and not April 1st. I think it's really telling that this whole section, this whole part of the Constitution was enacted when it was July 1st. 46 states do it on July 1st. The city of New York is July 1st. If the legislature wants to have even the pretense of exercising a more effective and important role in the budget process, it should want the process to be a fiscal year that begins July 1st and set an enactment date, a statutory enactment date, also a few weeks earlier than that. Some other ideas of support have included Senator Kruger's bill to create a legislative budget office modeled on the CBO, to switch to GAAP accounting basis, but also, finally, one thing that's simply behavioral. The legislature, on the one hand, is upset with its weakness in the budget process, but the legislature has not enforced reporting deadlines for the financial plan, the mid-year financial update, for instance. That, at a minimum, is what the legislature ought to do, and while it's not necessarily a significant thing, do what it's supposed to do in the quick start deadlines in November also. There's more issues we can get at beyond this that have to do with the way where the legislature actually has, in my view, lost its power in recent years in a way that I think has been voluntary or through neglect. But we can get to that in our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so just quickly, I think this is an important conversation that we're having, despite, as EJ was going through it, how supposedly old it is. And it's certainly an argument and a power struggle that's been going on for as long as I have been covering New York government and politics, which is going on 2 decades now. But you do have an interesting situation where the governor now has said he intends to seek a 4th term in 2022, and also a legislature that's relatively young. And I mean that in terms of leadership, and we have a veteran member with us. Yeah, but you have so many new people who are not familiar with the budget and its many intricacies and the various different power differentials that exist at the state capitol. And I think that, as EJ has indicated, if in fact this governor's past is any prologue, he's going to continue to push the envelope. And in fact, you could have a situation where we do end up back with litigation. So without further ado, you have a very distinguished panel here with you of these folks not only steeped in experience in the litigation of this particular issue, but also have had this conversation in various different forms before with various different iterations. I'm not going to go through all of their bios. We'll be here a long time. So it is my understanding is it is in the folder that you've got, and if in fact you want to make sure that their credentials are stellar, you can not just take my word for it. So we're going to start with just a sort of quick response to what EJ said. We know that Mr. Brodsky is chomping at the bit for, no bit. No bit. You don't want to speak then?
No, I'll speak.
Oh, okay. 5 to 7 minutes. Gentlemen, nobody's chomping. Okay, people are calm and reasoned. Sir, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you to the Empire Center, who does an extraordinary job of civic engagement and intellectual ferment, wrong as they are on almost everything. Thank you to the Carey family for their continuation of the legacy of the governor. It is not, as you heard earlier, that he clamped down on the budget. It's that he preserved the humane and effective function of government and the social fabric at a time of great stress, and I'm proud to be here under his name. Thank you to my colleagues on the panel, EJ, of course, but particularly Judge Smith, who's a distinguished jurist, a smart guy, a well-spoken man, a decent man, wrong again a lot of the time.
I knew that was coming.
but the model for what we would want in the Court of Appeals judges. And Peter Kiernan has had a career in public service that is to be envied and has made contributions to numerous administrations and issues and is similarly a model for most of that. That being said, the two of them have ruined the state. The budget process that we are engaged in today is worthy of Vladimir Putin and the Saudi Arabian monarchy. It is a grant of authoritarian power consistent with EJ's distaste for legislative function. There is no way in a democracy that the lawmaking power should be vested as entirely in the governor as it is with respect to the current practices of the budget. And the consequences are awful. If I had a disappointment, it would mainly be, in terms of reaction to this, it would mainly be about the progressive interest groups that whose lobbying efforts in the last few years have been to go to the governor's office in January, February, and say, please include me in the 30-day amendments so that we don't have to worry about the difficult process of having legislative decision-making made about important public policy issues. The heart of the matter is who has the power to make the social and economic judgments that govern the people of the state. I invite you to take your phones out and look up the word appropriation on the internet. And what you will find is a sum of money or total of assets devoted to a special purpose. That's what it is. And the distinguished Court of Appeals judges who rendered the opinions there, keeping in mind there is no majority opinion as to governing most of this. There's the three that joined Judge Smith. There's Judge Rosenblatt. It's chaos, and that chaos works for authoritarian government. The notion that public policy is captured and circumvented by the appropriation process is aconstitutional. I invite you to look at other sections of the state constitution which were ignored by the Pataki court. And I invite you to look at the section, Article 2, Section 1. The legislative power of the state is vested in the Senate and Assembly. And at the heart of the Silver v. Pataki v. Assembly cases are the notion and an intellectual distinction between budgeting and appropriation and legislating. And Judge Smith left plenty of room for maneuver in that debate. But when there are policy issues to be decided, the best practice is to leave that to the legislative body elected by the people and not give the governor the functional equivalent of dictatorial powers. The decision, what I try to avoid in the statement, and I'll close with this, is the parsing of the judge's decision, because it's a worthy exercise, but it's not what's at stake at a forum dedicated to the visions and principles of few carry. What's at stake is how we govern ourselves and how much power we would vest in an authoritarian executive. We are not Russia. We are not Saudi Arabia. We are the great state of New York, and we need to relieve ourselves of this burden. Thank you.
Mr. Brodsky, thank you. Judge?
Oh, well, thank you for all those kind words. No, I do. I do mean that. I appreciate the kind words, and I also appreciate combat, and I'm getting both there. I like that. I think I'd start by saying that Assemblyman Brodsky is really, although you wouldn't think so, the governor's best friend in this debate, because he thinks that the Constitution, as interpreted by the Court of Appeals, has made the governor into a dictator. He's Vladimir Putin, and I'm sure that the governor will not be sorry to hear that that's what the Constitution says, and that he is indeed have authoritarian power. But I really don't think it's right, and I think that both the Assemblyman and the governor are committing the same error by overreading the Pataki against Silver decision. I'm sorry, I can't even get the name right. It's either Silver v. Pataki or Pataki against New York State Assembly. But whatever it's called, I don't think it says what both the governor and the assemblyman seem to think it says. I do not think it creates a dictatorship. It does, I think, read the Constitution to mean what it says. And the Constitution does, and was supposed to, give a good deal of budgeting authority to the governor. And that's the premise Stimson and Root and all those famous people and Al Smith were talking about going back to 1915. They didn't actually say, although someone I know who knows this area did say, look, the legislature is a money-spending machine, and nobody except the governor is ever going to keep the state out of bankruptcy. But that was the general idea. The fundamental perception that what a legislator cares about is whether the particular his particular district or the particular interest group that he or she is representing gets money out of the state, and really only the governor is going to care about whether the state runs out of money or not. That rather simple premise is the reason why we have executive budgeting, and what my sort of vision of what the Constitution did when the executive budgeting was finally enacted in 1927 was that in the area of budgeting it reversed the roles of the legislature and the governor. It said when we're talking about the budget, the governor writes the laws, the legislature gets a veto instead of the other way around. And I think if you think of it that way, it was a very important change. It gives the governor very, very substantial power, but it didn't make him a dictator. And I don't think the case can fairly be read to say that he's a dictator. And I want to spend a few minutes really talking about what the case does not say. It does say that when the governor sends up a budget that really is a budget and that says what money shall be spent on, and you can't, by the way, try to make the distinction the assemblyman just made between making policy and the budget is impossible. The budget is policy. The budget will always be policy. It is obviously a matter of policy, how much money we spend on the schools, how much money we spend on medical care. Those are very important issues of policy. Some of us think that's actually more important than a lot of the sexy issues that get the headlines. But it is a power limited to a budgetary function, and the court was convinced in I'm going to get it right this time, Silver against Pataki, and I'm still convinced that what Governor Pataki had done there really was budgetary, that he really was talking about how to spend money, and that for that reason the case was upheld. There are two important things that the governor still can't do, and nothing in the case says he can do it. The first is the ancient technique which legislatures have used from time immemorial, since in most places, including Washington, it is the legislature that writes the budget, and the governor has only a veto power. And what is done all the time is to attach to some needed expenditure that the country can't or the state can't live without a completely unrelated bill that the governor would oppose and try to force it down his throat. And now when the governor has the legislative power, there's a risk that he will do the same thing. But there is something called the anti-rider clause in the state constitution which says you can't do that. It says that, I'm going to screw it up because I'm trying to quote from memory, but the general idea is that you can't have anything in an appropriation bill that isn't limited, germane to and limited in its effect to the appropriation, so that the tradition of doing the contrary goes back at least to something called the Wilmot Proviso in 1846, which was a good thing, but nevertheless exactly the sort of thing that that's prohibited. The anti-rider provision of the Constitution, I believe, has existed longer than executive budgeting. It limits whoever writes the budget, saying, look, all you can put in there is things germane and limited to the effect of the particular appropriation. It is my, from what I know of what the present governor has tried to do, or maybe tried not that hard to do, has threatened to do and then backed off, looks to me like an obvious violation of the anti-rider clause. Maybe, who knows what a court will later say. But to me, there's nothing in either in the Constitution or in the Silver v. Pataki decision that would authorize that. And perhaps that's why the governor has backed off on doing it, because it seems to me that he's bluff when he says, you can't have this appropriation unless you pass my other 16 bills, which I are part of my pet program. I think he's basically bluffing. I don't think he can do that. I think it's unconstitutional. The other and more interesting to me issue is the whether, without violating the anti-rider clause, you can use the leverage given you by the budgetary power to essentially usurp more legislative power than just budgeting. That is, whether the governor could say, well, I'm appropriating this much money for schools, but we're not going to have any money go to schools where either the teachers are allowed to carry guns or where the teachers are not allowed to carry guns. Do it either way you want. But whether you turn it into your position, whether you can leverage the money into an essentially non-fiscal issue, and have your social views or your views of appropriate legislation forced down the throats of the legislature, that was a question that we explicitly ducked. That is the plurality. My opinion, joined by Judges Reed and Graffio, explicitly ducked that issue. However, you may be interested to know that the majority, that is the two dissenting judges, Judge Kaye and Judge Siparik, who obviously would not have accepted what I'm talking about. They wouldn't even accept the perfectly reasonable, for some strange reason they didn't agree with me. They wouldn't even accept what we did in Silver Urban's Protect. They certainly would not have accepted this gun control nonsense that I just suggested. And Judge Rosenblatt's opinion, joined by my namesake, George Bundy Smith, also said very clearly, no, that's unconstitutional. So there were 4 votes in Silver against Pataki to say you can't play that kind of game. So I think you should all be reassured that the governor is not Vladimir Putin, and and Vladimir Putin is not the governor. That is, everyone except Assemblyman Brodsky and Governor Cuomo will be pleased to hear that.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Kieran.
Well, thank you, Liz,
Yeah.
and thank you to the center. I would like to say something about Governor Carey's legacy in budgeting right at the end here, if I get an opportunity. I've been on a panel with Judge Smith and my much admired friend Richard Brodsky a few years ago discussing Silver Pataki, but then I think as now we're really talking about budget politics and the allocation of political power. The executive budgeting is a fact. As EJ points out, this 90th anniversary of the first executive budget, that's not going to change. Governor Pataki interpreted executive budgeting in a way that was, prior to that, hadn't been done before, and when he put policy language into appropriation bills. And of course, the legislature can affect the appropriation. They could strike it out or they could reduce it, but an appropriation is a number. They can't change the language. And so that was what was litigated. Now, where I come into this, and perhaps can add something, is that I was counsel to Governor David Patterson, and Governor Patterson in 2010 took the logical extension of Silver versus Pataki quite far. But I think we should keep in mind, I'll get into the details of that, but budgets shape the political dialogue in almost every state. It's the premier political event. And it's the elected politicians and the bureaucratic politicians and the special interests that participate in that political dialogue, and the facts and circumstances are key. The budgets reflect the political circumstances of a state as much as they do the financial circumstances, in my view. So in 2009, if you'll recall, I know Senator Kruger does very well, and many of you do, the state was in the grip of the so-called Great Recession. The revenues of the state had fallen through the floor, and they were not showing any signs of recovering. In the midst of 2009, Governor Patterson submitted a program to eliminate the then budget gap, and the legislature basically told him to pound sand. They wouldn't do anything about it. Now that's anomalous to me. As you know, the governor is required to submit a balanced budget. The executive budget has to be balanced. That's facially balanced. And the legislature is required since 2007 to pass a balanced budget, but of course that's facially balanced. They're using cash book accounting, and there's no set definitions of revenues, and it's only the general fund, and it's really accounting-wise, you could not prove it's balanced. But more importantly, it's balanced on the day it's enacted. It's never in balance another day for the rest of the year. And what I find most egregious is that the legislature and the governor are under no obligation to finish the year in balance. So when Patterson asked that there be corrections, mid-year corrections, the legislature refused. They were right to refuse in the sense that they had no obligation to bring the budget into balance. Nevertheless, we had some dire financial circumstances in 2009. Of course, that was the year, it's been observed around Albany and podcasts and so forth. That was the year of the coup. This is the 10th anniversary of the Senate coup, which further complicated the politics tremendously. And we were going into an election year when we entered the budget season for 2010. Now, just to backtrack for a second, executive budgeting gives the governor the power of initiative, but it also gives him the duty of initiative, and it makes the governor ultimately the responsible party and the accountable party. So as the budget season of 2010 unfolded, the governor, adhering to the necessity to make tremendous cuts in spending, and had to give some very unpleasant choices to the legislature. And many of those choices he put policy language a la George Pataki into appropriation bills. And the legislature, for its own particular reasons, set all those aside, which they have been doing for a long time. Governor submits a budget, the legislature sets it aside, promulgates its own budget, and then negotiations begin. That is, the politics begins. And throughout the budget negotiations of 2010, for fiscal 2010, an impasse was reached. It was our view, it was Governor Patterson's view, that the legislature was failing to recognize the gravity of the fiscal crisis or it was really a severe revenue crisis, was failing to grapple with the implications of that, and was unwilling to do those things that were most unpleasant in an election year. So an impasse carried on, and in years past, and in many, many years past, when the budget was late, which had been routinely the case since 1985, extenders were passed that simply continued spending at the prior year's level so that wages could be paid and payrolls could be met. But Governor Patterson unprecedentedly put his policy language in the extender bills, which meant that the legislature either had to pass the extender bill or shut down functions of the government that were contained within that extender. Now, Governor Patterson had been a career legislator. He had voted for Proposition 1 and supported the 2005 constitutional amendment that it was rejected. He didn't come to appreciate Silver versus Pataki until he was the governor. So, but nevertheless, he, in a sense, he gave peace a chance. He didn't do everything all at once. He did these extender bills over 10 weeks because he never gave up on the notion that there might be a negotiated solution, but there never was. And so over a period of several weeks, he had caused a budget to be enacted. He was the man that was responsible. He was the man that was held accountable. As he said, he united the electorate. They all hated him because he did a lot of very, very unpleasant things. But he was the one that did it. And I think that's exactly what the Stimson report of 1915 intended, that there had to be at least one man responsible and held accountable. So the question now is, Governor Patterson, one more point, Governor Patterson could have put some other things in those extenders that he wanted very much. For example, he wanted an obesity tax. He wanted what was then called SUNY 2020, or SUNY empowerment. He wanted wine to be sold in grocery stores. But in the end, he decided that there was insufficient political support for those things. So he didn't put them in. And then the question is raised in the Judge Smith's opinion, could Silver v. Pataki be abused? The governor was careful not to abuse it. I think in the ensuing years, it has not been abused because Governor Cuomo has pulled back from the brink, but this time he really approached the brink in a big, big way and did not entirely pull back. So my final point, I guess, would be that Silver versus Pataki, which just reflects what the existing law is, namely executive budgeting, is a very useful tool in hard times, in difficult times, economic times. It's less so in good times. And I can tell you right now, compared to what circumstances were during the Great Recession, these are very good times, despite all the anti-Trump rhetoric that is starving us of revenues. I think the state, relatively speaking, is awash in cash. And these are good times, and you don't necessarily have to abuse it. I began by saying budgets allocate political power. Silver versus Pataki allocates power, but it doesn't enhance it. That depends on the political strength of the people involved. Politics, as classically defined, is the struggle for power. Silver versus Pataki, I think, embodies or epitomizes that striving, that struggle. Every budget negotiation does. I think we've seen in certain years where the legislature didn't struggle in the way that it could have and perhaps should have. and maybe will in the future. But I don't think we need to change the law. We need to change political behavior.
Mr.
Thanks.
Kiernan, thank you. So, EJ began by talking about how the foundation of executive budgeting and the decisions that formed it were actually still germane and not outdated, and that we, what was your word, infantilize, I believe, the people who, because they didn't know, et cetera. But I would argue that there's still actually a case to be made that there's quite a bit that has changed since then, that the folks, be the Al Smith et al. As it may, how forward-thinking they were, could never have imagined the internet sales tax, online sports betting, the intricacies of Medicaid, the intricacies and the bastardization of the school aid funding formula, et cetera. And so I guess the question needs to be asked, I mean, is it time for us to revisit that? We haven't tried since the constitutional amendment failed in 2005. You haven't actually brought another, on the legislative side, I guess I would start with you, Assemblyman, on this. Haven't brought another case, although arguably you've got not a Pataki court anymore, but a Cuomo court, which most likely would side with the governor, although I'm not entirely sure because it hasn't been tested. Or at the very least, why not override, I mean, or exercise that? You've got a Democrat-dominated legislature. We haven't seen an override since Pataki.
A couple of introductory explanatory things. This is not about the future of executive budgeting. I do not oppose executive budgeting properly understood. Two, I do not share my colleagues' nostalgia for 1915 when women couldn't vote and rotten boroughs upstate governed the policy and politics of the state. We are here today, and today, conceitedly by both folks, there's been a accretion of power to the governor that is unhealthy. Eventually,
they
Carl,
didn't say that.
they did, and more importantly, they didn't say the unhealthy part. They
Right.
said the accretion of power. I said the
He
unhealthy
came
part.
up to the brink and pushed the envelope and stepped back.
Okay, I withdraw accretion of power.
Okay.
He came up to the brink. What do you want from me?
That's what I wanted.
In the end, to answer the question directly, the legislature should stand up on its hind feet and say no. This is not a matter in which the legislature is the innocent victim. It whines like a victim a lot, but it doesn't do anything.
Yes.
Their pay is attached to an on-time budget, which the court in one of the decisions said delay is the only legitimate political tactic the legislature has. Commissions making laws. Yes, the legislature should stand up on its feet. I leave that to Senator Kruger to explain why they haven't at the end. But the imbalance of practical power cannot be denied. It isn't working, and someday Carl Palladino is going to get elected governor. And he's not going to be nice by Peter Kiernan. And he's going to put a repeal of the abortion laws and appeal of the gun laws into the budget
Whoa,
and
hold
look at
on.
the state legislature and go,
No. First
Do-
of all,
do
Carl
what you will.
Palladino's not going to get elected. You mean like a Carl Palladino-esque type individual?
I
guess you could
accept the
talk to Nick.
amendment.
You could talk to Nick Langworthy about that. But I think that the judge, who I'd like to go next, if you wouldn't mind, sir, has already said that, and it's established in the decision, that there is a certain point past which the governor cannot legally go, and getting rid of abortion rights, for example, would be one of them. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I don't like the implicit assumption that I'd be so horrified at going back to 1915. I am a reactionary.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, but
You saved me a difficult moment.
yeah, but it's certainly true that look, even I might get a little nervous with Carl Palladino, but I'd be thrilled if George Pataki became governor again. Can somebody get him to run? But whoever it is, and for better or worse, their powers are more limited than the assemblyman thinks or than this governor thinks. And indeed, I think there's evidence that this governor knows in his heart that he hasn't got quite as much power as he pretends he has, and the legislature should stop believing him.
Well, I'm just curious, if in fact there was another lawsuit along these lines, how do you believe the current court would rule?
Well, and of course you did dare to mention the fact that the governor has appointed every one of the 7. Look, I don't know. I can tell you how I think they should rule. Some of the stuff that he is proposing is as clear a violation of the anti-rider clause as you can possibly imagine. And I don't think you can assume that every judge is going to vote in accordance with the executive who appointed him. There are quite a few counterexamples in the history of the world. So I would, I suspect that if the governor were totally confident that he could get away with what he's doing, he would not have pulled back from the brink all those times.
But given the modernization and the complication that has ensued that I mentioned at the outset before we sort of got into the meat of this question and got off on a couple of tangents, do you believe, in fact, Mr. Kiernan, if you would, that it's time to revisit this issue?
No, I don't. I think that we should be aware of the fact that throughout our history, I'm talking about the United States history as well as the state, there's always a tension between executive and legislative power. They're not that clearly defined in the various constitutions. And that tension, I think, is a productive tension. It's the nature of politics. And since politics tends to return to the mean like everything else, I think that it reaches balances when it should. But this tension, the executives are always trying to expand their power. Certainly, when Woodrow Wilson was a scholar at Princeton in 1896, he wrote a book in which he asserted that the Speaker of the House should and would be the dominant figure in United States politics. And then when he became the president, he took an entirely different point of view. But presidents have asserted their power. Certainly Franklin Roosevelt expanded executive power. Just about every president had. In most recent years, George W. Bush in his signing statements expanded power. President Obama issued sweeping executive orders right after Watergate and after the Vietnam War. The Congress grabbed power from the executive by passing the War Powers Act. Of course, we're witnessing a tremendous struggle between the legislature and the executive in respect of President Trump and Speaker Pelosi. These fights are just inherent in our politics, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think that what Governor Cuomo had is a very domineering and very, I should say, dominant
No, you were right.
governor who wants to use all of his power, but he's not a political fool. And if I were his counsel, which I never will be, I assure you, he would. I would advise, don't push this to the brink so that we do get legislation.
Well, and
litigation.
And he benefits from a weak legislature. I mean, and he benefits from also years and years of late budgets that he basically ran on making the trains run on time. That was his de facto argument essentially for getting elected in 2010.
Well,
and then subsequently he did. And now we've had more or less on-time budgets.
Yeah, 10 seconds to that. I mean, after what Governor Patterson did, we haven't had a late budget.
Correct.
Now, a lot of that's the skill of the Governor Cuomo, but he impliedly, and perhaps explicitly, I wasn't there, but he certainly impliedly said, if we don't reach a deal by the deadline, I'm going to do what Patterson did, except I'm going to put everything in one extender.
Is that healthy?
Whether it is or it's not, that's what he did, and we got a an on-time budget. I just
Is
point
that
out.
healthy,
But
Peter?
hold
Come
on.
Well, I would say there should have
Yes, it
been
is.
time for
Yeah,
more.
but
negotiation.
arguably, if he did it, then the legislature would react. I mean, he hasn't done it, but you say, is it healthy that he can threaten to do it? We don't even know if it would be legally feasible, ostensibly.
Up until 2010, I was sitting there when this happened. The threat is a compulsion to do things that would not otherwise be done. The threat of successful incorporation of legislation into an extender is it's not the way we want to allocate power. And for Peter, who is a great lawyer, to simply say, I'm not going to tell you whether that's a good thing or not, is not, it's not good enough, Peter.
Well, then
Well, you didn't
challenge it-
give me a
then
chance to
challenge
answer
it.
either.
Go ahead.
Well, can I make a point? I just wanted to, I at the risk of not contradicting, but like taking a different side for something Peter said about what Patterson did in 2010, I don't think that was enabled or built on Silver v.
I was
Pataki or
gonna just say
Pataki
that has
v.
nothing to do
Assembly.
with Silver v. Pataki.
I think that power was there all along. I remember watching it unfold and thinking, finally, when I worked in the Assembly in the early 90s, and being in the minority, we were largely reduced to spectators much of the time.
Right.
Reading the Constitution, trying to learn the Constitution, talking to the councils in the office about what it meant and some of the people who understood it better. I remember seizing upon this and thinking, well, here, we can't pass a budget unless the governor submits the bill. That's why we're getting these extenders. Why doesn't the governor just start submitting the whole budget? We talked about this at the time privately. In 1991, Governor Cuomo broke a budget impasse,
Mario
Cuomo, and made his veto stand because Rapplier, the leader of the Assembly at the time, had 55 votes and said that he would stand with the governor on a veto override. The composition of the legislature is extremely important too. Governor Patterson's strategy, which basically was, okay, you can't pass any bill to keep government going unless I send it to you. I'm not sending you routine extenders. Here is the Education, Labor, and Family Assistance Bill. Pass it or not. What the Senate knew, the Senate was in chaos at the time, but had a marginal Democratic majority. The Assembly was kind of in the background on some of this stuff, publicly opposed to not spending as much more as it wanted to. But the key factor was this governor had the Republican Senate in his corner with 30 votes. Everybody knew there was going to be no veto override, so that he had two hammers. He had his ability to submit the budget, and he had his ability to make a veto stand. Now, around the whole time of this case being decided, the legislature overrode, two different parties overrode Pataki hundreds of times.
Yep.
That's the other fact that we're forgetting about. I want to mention one other thing because I couldn't help mentioning this because of what Mr. Brodsky said about that 1915 and the ancient history and all that. Actually, Richard, you sound very much like a 1920s Coolidge era upstate small town Republican.
Thank you.
Because what you were saying about Putin and Saudi Arabia and authoritarian government was exactly what they said about Al Smith's proposal. This was argued at length, fiercely debated, especially in his 1924 campaign against Teddy Roosevelt Jr. And they said, you want to give yourself czar-like powers. They talked about nothing but this, practically. It was all played out.
I am not an opponent of executive budgeting. I'm an opponent of including policy matters in there. May I ask the judge a question?
Go ahead.
What would happen if the legislature took the governor's submission on February 1st and voted it down?
And then passed a resolution to replace it?
That's your question. Let me ask my question.
Well, but isn't that what they'd have to do?
No, that's what the question to the judge is.
You mean voted down the whole budget?
Lock, stock, and barrel. What would the constitutional process be for enactment of a budget?
Interesting question. I guess the governor has to come up with another one, right?
No, I would
No?
argue that the
Can we put down-
legislature then has the power. It may have to do separate appropriations. It may take 6 weeks to conduct the votes, but the legislature has the power to enact its own version of the budget. In other words, if you're going to get cute about this budget thing and not directly confront the heart of the problem, the legislature has powers that it has chosen not to exercise, and I think much to the derogation of the interests of the people of the state. It is an interesting question.
I'm really not sure you're right.
I'm not sure I'm right either.
Yeah, I think if they do that, I think you've got your classic constitutional standoff.
Could the legislature pass an appropriation bill?
I do not think it could pass. I do not think it could pass what amounted to an amended version of what it had just turned down. But I don't know.
But
I haven't really thought about
But
that.
if it wrote something new out of whole cloth, then what?
The governor has to sign it, so the governor could
He
veto
doesn't
it.
have to sign the whole thing. Oh, he does have to sign the whole thing if the legislature passes a brand new, yeah.
Yeah, but I get you. The question is,
Okay.
can the legislature, after it's rejected the budget in total, write its own? And I admit I never thought about that question until today. Maybe.
I think it can.
Answer is maybe.
And the answer to Peter's question is the governor could veto, and he would be responsible for a late budget, which is the politics behind a lot of this concentration of executive power. I do think it is a matter that the legislature should actively consider, and I don't know if it has.
No, it did. There were some backroom discussions about it, so much so that I actually asked a former Pataki-era official, who I won't name because he's not here, but about this question, and his response was not legal. I don't. What do you think, Peter?
Well, what would not be legal for the?
For the legislature to pass to reject in
En bloc.
full the budget and then subsequently do something on its own.
Well, I know in 1980, I was counsel to the Democrats in the state Senate that were in the minority. And this was under Governor Carey. The budgets that had been passed in the Carey era up to then were dealing with a fiscal crisis, and it was very, very responsible legislating and governing. But I think in 1980, I mean, I was an eyewitness to a lot of it, the legislature got a little tired of all the austerity, and Governor Carey wanted to have even more austerity. I remember he wanted a spending cap, which then was considered an anathema. So the legislature passed its own budget in its entirety. And for the first time in 116 years, Governor Carey, vetoed the entire budget. And so then he was overridden in the Assembly, which had a supermajority. And in the Senate, the Senate Democrats sustained the veto. So we did not have that circumstance. Much like you were referring to, Governor Pataki was overridden. Governor Carey was not overridden. And then there quickly became a negotiated solution. Governor Carey had to pull back some of the things he wanted. For instance, he never did get his spending cap, and a budget was enacted. But that was all politics. I mean,
I want to be able to leave time for questions before we run out of time, but I do want to just note, and to your point, Assemblyman, I mean, and I think to the point that Mr. Kieran just made, I mean, part of this issue when you argue about, is that healthy for the governor to be able to put everything he wants into an extender and then say, choose between what I have put on the table initially and shutting down the government, and then it's on your head? Don't get there. I mean, the whole point is don't get to, no, not fold, negotiate. That's what the process
You can't negotiate
is.
without inequality of power. That is the lesson of life.
But you have argued it. I mean, I think EJ, rather not you, has argued there is an equality of power.
Richard,
The equality of
can I
power is
suggest
override. The equality of power is, making it your own threats, essentially.
I do
Richard,
not
can I-
think there's anyone in this House or anyone in Albany who thinks there is an equality of power between Andrew Cuomo and the two.
But that's a political reality.
I don't think it is.
Can I offer a scenario under which, and tell me where this doesn't add up other than simply willpower? In the latest budget, this year's budget, okay, And the legislature, there was a lot of consternation about we're being rushed, we're being forced. The governor's got all this stuff in the bills, and aside from all the ephemera, the plastic bag ban, all the other stuff, and the things you passed quickly, like the abortion law before it even got to the budget.
Which he hated, by the way.
Well, whatever he thought. But why wouldn't one way the legislature could have enacted a full budget, and I mentioned this scenario in my paper, if the legislature wanted to say, okay, we've taken final action, by the way, having painted themselves into the corner of having their pay raise depend on it.
Because they agreed to it.
But one way they could have taken final action was say, okay, here's the budget, here's with our ads, which we understand you're going to want to veto, but we're taking final action. This is a stage.
Right.
And, oh, by the way, we have stricken and reduced everything for the Empire State Development Corp,
Right.
which is nearly 100% yours. It's under your control. It's your baby. It's not in there. No one is going to wake up tomorrow crying that their life has changed because you don't have your ESDC budget. And here's a few other things we've stricken too. Okay, we're done now with this stage. Clock ticks midnight on March 31st. Now we'll
Supplemental
go to
budget.
the next stage, right?
Supplemental budget.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, that power is available to the legislature too, and was. Right?
If there is any doubt about it, I believe the legislature has not been sufficiently aggressive in protecting its prerogatives. I do think that the reason the legislature is in this bind is because unconstitutionally and wrongly, policy matters are being put into appropriation bills which shouldn't be there. And the notion that, we didn't actually say that in the three-judge opinion that Judge Smith has referenced, everybody is responsible for the natural foreseeable consequences of their action. What's going on now is the natural foreseeable consequence of Pataki v. Silver and ought to be changed.
So do you believe that that extends to the legislature's willingness to usurp its own power by kicking difficult decisions to unelected commissions?
Yes,
Because they should stop doing that.
yes. Take the yes.
Okay, fine.
You-
Because that just makes me
you mean
angry.
Yes, Silver Pataki did that too?
No, I don't
No,
mean
he
that. I
doesn't mean that.
That there has been a regression of willingness to assert legislative prerogatives, which has bad consequences for the people of the state.
So, questions. I'm shocked. Go ahead, Bob.
Put very simply, isn't this really just a case of the governor using the tools he has and the legislature not using the tools it has?
Yes.
Yes.
No. The tools.
Did you wait till they all said yes?
Yes.
before you said no?
Yes, I
Yes,
did.
he did that on purpose.
And that's the heart of the debate, but at least I've been having with my distinguished colleagues, that Silver v. Pataki rigs the entire political dynamic as well as the legal dynamic, and the notion that the legislature should be forced to law or forced to maneuvers is a bad budgeting system for the people of the state.
Well, my question goes to, you've even said they've abdicated some of their responsibility under this process. They haven't stood up as far as they could. They haven't used their legislative prerogatives. A negotiation is a conversation where one person uses its leverage and the other person realizes its leverage, like the speaker you served under, Shelley Silver, understood leverage better than anybody this town's ever seen.
I am not going to criticize the legislature for trying to find a coherent way, politically and legally, to wrestle with the destructive consequences of
You're
Silver.
looking for coherence in politics?
No, I'm for politics.
No, you're looking for coherence in
Are
it,
you
though?
for coherence, too?
I'm
It's a
sometimes.
I guess I think that the extension of that argument is, why is this a cogent conversation to have vis-a-vis should we change Silver v. Pataki, the outcome, is it time to revisit, et cetera, if the legislature isn't even exercising the limited capabilities that it already has because it's so cowed?
Because to do that, they are dependent on another branch of government, the judiciary. And that is not a constitutionally sound way to balance power, either in a negotiation or in a court of law.
But that's a whole different conversation.
It is not. It is exactly what you raised.
It's not. I mean,
It is.
frequently, not always, but frequently
You
the
wanna make
judiciary.
a more department dependent on the judiciary. Yeah.
Well,
ahead,
th-
Scott.
th-
Go ahead.
that's a very good question, because the weakness I foresee in my own position is if you do get the court to do what it says Judge Smith said it's willing to do, make a distinction between legislative function and appropriation/budget function, you do get into a justiciable issue kind of debate that's worth having. But I'm not there yet. I'm so far behind the 8 ball that I'm willing to postpone that until we get a principled understanding that the governor proposes, the legislature disposes, the governor vetoes, the legislature overrides, and that's the essential system that works in a democracy.
It is just to point out, though, the judicial branch doesn't always weigh in on matters of power struggle between the executive and legislative branches. I mean, for example, in the much maligned and often discussed CFE decision, I mean, there was a decision, and then subsequently, but we don't want to enforce the decision.
Fortunately, they messed around in the budget, so we don't have to worry about CFE.
Okay. Questions? Anyone else? Dad? Hi, Dad. Okay.
No,
Oh,
go ahead.
stop. No, you'll
There's
get,
one behind him.
you'll
One
get the
behind
next one.
What seems to me is missing is that the transcendent character.
You don't have the mic, Dad. Go ahead.
He can be heard. Go ahead.
I'd like to comment on this. The executive is transcendent in contemporary life, and government's reified in the executive. And so the whole, when we teach about this in political science, we talk about formal powers and informal powers. Now, the informal powers have become so compelling and important that the interaction between the two is troubling. And that's evident at every level of government. So that this discussion, it seems to me, is contextually not fully considerate of the context, the contemporary context. Then the remedy, if we could comment on this, the remedy is on the formal side because the informal side is unreachable.
I strongly agree with that. I do not think the informal side is unreachable. I think it's a consequence often of the formal side, and I do think it's at the heart of my complaint about the judge's decision.
Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
Kind of tying one item that each of you had mentioned, not including legislative items in the budget, not shoving things down the legislature's throat, and the budget process truly is a power struggle, a political power struggle. Do you think one thing that the legislature could do, and it wouldn't require legislation, it wouldn't require rules changes, would be simply to state to the governor, you have a choice. You can provide us with a budget that includes policy issues, legislative items, but we are going to hold hearings on each of those items, as they should be. They should be vetted, and that may slow down the budget process. We don't get an April 1st budget, but that's your choice. Or you can provide us a clean budget. We get April 1st out of the way, and then we start on your policy items. Do you think that could be one solution that the legislature could do and kind of stand up on its heels?
But wouldn't the logical response, particularly given what Peter Kiernan was talking about in terms of what I call like the nuclear option or the all or nothing option that was pioneered by the Patterson administration, wouldn't the governor be like, fine, stall all you want, and then on April 1st, you'll pass my budget? Or you'll shut down the government. Why would he not respond in that manner?
Or you'll get an extender.
That's what I mean,
Yeah.
that you'll get an extender and it'll include everything that I want. And while you've been sort of messing around with your hearings and refusing to meet with me and negotiate, I'll just force you to pass this, or you'll shut down the government and the public will know it's your fault.
I think we go back to the train on time. I think for the public, it's not so much the train on time. Is it a miserable ride, or is it a good ride? And where your destination is, does it get you to the place you actually want to go? So I think the public, outside of Albany probably, they really don't care about the time. It's the what. And you can see reactions to when they start including things in the budget that really aren't budget items, the reaction from the public that we don't like it. It was shoved down not just the legislature's throat, but our throat.
Can I just add a footnote to that? You know, just a few years ago, Illinois went 3 years without a budget. And I think Pennsylvania went in excess of 2 years. In both instances, their bond ratings fell precipitously, which meant that for them to borrow, those states to borrow, it became far more expensive. And there were certain other things that couldn't get accomplished. And they were basically a political gridlock.
Lock.
Lock. And I can't itemize this, but I would guess there were certain businesses that made business decisions about what they were going to do in those states or not do in those states, based on the fact that fundamentally their legislators were not functioning. So, but that's an extreme where you have in excess of 2 years or as much as 3 years. A couple of weeks probably doesn't matter. You know, Richard asked before, is that a good thing? I think what Patterson did is not a bad example, is keep trying to reach a negotiated solution. But, you know, if you're there is a virtue in being able to close off the debate at some point.
I think also I would argue that your premise is somewhat misconstrued, because if you go back and look at the public opinion polls during that time, I mean, look, the legislature's never been held terribly high in public opinion, but the numbers fell precipitously the longer we went without an on-time budget. And the reality is that the public probably, and this isn't to denigrate people, but understands very little about what actually happens here, and which is, of course, to the benefit of the people who wield the levers of power. But subsequently, they do understand budgets. They understand that the main thing that the legislature and the governor are charged with is getting a budget, and if they just can't get the darn thing on time over and over and over and over again, yes, that makes people angry. And then you say, but are you stuffing policy down the throat of the legislature and the public? That's a little bit more nuanced and difficult for people to understand unless they understand how the budget works.
Can I ask a naive question? I mean, isn't there, I don't understand politics, isn't there a difference between a late budget and a shutdown? I don't know how the public's going to react to a late budget, but if the public employees aren't getting paychecks, people are going to notice.
Yes, that's true. David?
I think one of the things we're missing is the whole thing now, and to be fair to the present legislators, they're not getting paid. The April 1st not getting paid, if you don't have the budget passed, is a very significant thing. And I don't agree with Mr. Bellafiore and some of it, because that really was something that Sheldon Silver agreed to.
Yep.
You know, he was offered the charters for a pay raise and turned it down. He then had to eat three things: a dairy compact, not getting paid, and the whole thing. So that's a very significant thing right now, because this observation, late budgets really don't matter as much to the people outside. You can make it, and especially now about not getting paid, because it plays a political dynamic. That's what's really changed. And I think the only one other thing that I thought Peter's comments particularly struck me, because when I think about Hugh Carey had been a legislator and actually treated money as if it was going to be spent. Governor Pataki was a legislator and in some ways had a similar kind of thing. And as you said, with Governor Patterson having been a legislator, he didn't put things in the budget, in even those extensions that he didn't think would have passed. He made a political reading because he did it as a legislator. Governor Cuomo, our present Governor Cuomo, not having been a legislator, is doing a political calculation.
Yeah.
And the observation about somebody coming down the line some point who has none of this background, is likely to cross those lines.
It is a fascinating observation that you note, because we've only had two governors, I mean, Eliot Spitzer's problem aside, who came out of the AG's office. So the question is there something there, which I've actually never thought about, what might be worthy of investigation, as a litigator who comes in, right, ostensibly. I mean, Andrew Cuomo didn't spend all that much time in courtroom, but that comes in with a mindset of an attorney and a litigator and a fighter, a prosecutor vis-a-vis a legislator, and the mindset that individual comes into, and the understanding of the power of the body. That's fascinating, actually. I think we've time for one more before we turn the floor over to the senator.
Mine's quick. Going back to the point about hearings on the substantive changes. If, in fact, the beginning of the fiscal year were changed to July 1st, might that affect the discussion or the outcome of the discussion that you've just been having? Because it would offer the legislature another 3 months, not just to do more technical explorations, but to delve much more substantively and much more deeply into the policy questions.
One might argue make more trouble as well, but
Well, I would,
yeah.
there's one obvious point. Delaying the budget to what most states do, the fiscal year to July 1, means that you know what the tax receipts were in April. And that takes a lot of guesswork out about what your revenues are. And that's valuable, I think, just in and of itself. And if you have the date at which the governor is supposed to submit an executive budget, keep that relatively early, then there would be virtue and time to have more hearings. Trouble is, like in 2010, where you had a desperate revenue crisis, and there were a number of legislators that simply didn't want to recognize that fact, didn't want to deal with it because it was an election year, then all the hearings in the world aren't going to solve your problem.
EJ, you're going to bookend for us?
Yes, I segue now into the Master of Ceremonies role because Tim had to leave, because to keep things on time, we're just warming up and could be going on longer. But I'd like to introduce our distinguished final speaker, Senator Liz Krueger. And again, she needs no introduction really to anybody in town, but she's, of course, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, one of the top players on the whole budget front here, and has been for quite a while. And she's been kind enough to join us today to offer some closing observations on the discussion we've been having, which will, I'm sure, continue in other venues for quite some time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. I enjoyed the panel immensely. I think there are pieces to agree and disagree with from all the speakers. So starting with Richard Brodsky, yes, I think the governor has too much structural power in the New York State Constitution and abuses that power. I think that we actually need to explore the possibility of a constitutional amendment that doesn't overreach, as I think the last attempt on a budget amendment did. I'm not sure exactly what structure it would take, but I would reemphasize what I think Richard was highlighting, the difference between appropriations and policy and blending the two dangerously. And I appreciate Judge Smith's explaining to me about the Ryder Amendment. Sorry, thought I had the phone off. Something must be blowing up because my phone seems to be suddenly. The fact that the governor is overreaching beyond what he's allowed to do. I'm not sure which person used the example, maybe Liz did, of the governor inserting in this year's budget the concept that if you don't accept this policy language over here, I will, after the fact, cut the funding for something you all desperately care about relating to tenants' rights and protections through the housing agency. But I won't even tell you what it is I'm demanding you do, because I won't put that language in until basically the day before the budget has to be passed. And so it was crazy. But you know what? The legislature immediately said, no, we're not even entertaining these proposals. So going back then also to, I think, several people on this panel, it is the job of the legislature to stand up and be more aggressive and learn better how to use the tools we do have constitutionally to make sure that we are representing the interests of 20 million New Yorkers correctly. And I think that it's been a very long time since the legislature played that role in this state. Now, it's politics. Look at the combination of leadership in both houses. And I would argue that the Senate Democrats have only been here 5.5 months. So every day is a learning curve. And I think we will get stronger and stronger and stronger. I personally would love to see 42 Democratic senators instead of 39 Democratic senators, because then you conceivably can have the kind of discussion that took place more during the Pataki years, where there were actual vetoes of legislation and an ability to override the vetoes. Right now, we don't have the ability to override a veto in the Senate, and that's a relevant factor. I'd like to take objection to, I think perhaps it was EJ's comment earlier, but maybe it was someone else's because people were talking. The argument that legislatures will just wildly spend and the job of the governors to make sure they don't. So I've been here since 2002, and that was George Pataki. George Pataki will go down in history as the borrow and spend governor. He spent us into a huge deficit hole. He didn't raise taxes, he lowered taxes, but the borrowing under his administration was mind-boggling. Perhaps only to be beaten by Andrew Cuomo's record when he completes his assignment, because he's also a borrow and spend governor. And there is less and less transparency about that in the budget, and that is wrong as well, and why I think improving the budget process and the way that budgets get decided is also critically related to making sure that the public and the legislature and the media have the facts. There is more obfuscation about budget details now, I think, than ever before in history. We should have an independent budget office who can actually tell you what's going on and score it from a non-political perspective. Thank you, EJ, for putting that in your paper. I absolutely believe we should have a July 1st budget. We had a scene in my first session out, my first budget, so to speak, as in leadership, where we were trying to decide revenues. And the governor, I believe, intentionally underestimated expected revenues in the belief that then we couldn't negotiate with him for more money in the budget. And then when April 15th came along, oops, we would have more revenue than he projected, but he would get to spend it and decide how to spend it because we will have already finished the budget. And we kicked capital off the budget, exactly, which may or may not happen now in some kind of strange trading card situation before the end of June. But I will say it is politics. The American public and New Yorkers seem to like having bully executives. We keep electing them. All right? I lived through Rudy Giuliani as the mayor of New York City. Elliot Spitzer, bully personality. Andrew Cuomo, I think, proudly bully personality. We elected Donald Trump. Well, not me. So, in fact, probably we could test you all now and raise your hands. But another New Yorker. So we seem to, even though we know we pay a big price on many levels for it, the public seems to enjoy bully personalities as their executives, and legislators, not that there aren't people who would see themselves as being aggressive and bully personalities in legislative bodies. It's not a one-to-one match because you're dealing with a match where it's supposed to be some combination of 212 versus 1. So it's a very difficult game to play out when you have a very structurally powerful executive through your constitutional process, through your historic process, than dealing with the politics versus a legislative body. I would say, I think, watch for the next couple of years how this plays out, because I don't go back to 1915. No one here actually does, but we won't ask for anyone's ages. But it's been forever since there were actually enough of a majority in both houses to potentially take on a governor. Peter Kiernan references the David Patterson period. I would say that much of that period was a complete anomaly to anything else that ever happened before or after. One never tried to take over a majority in a house after 70 years by only having a one-person majority. Bad move. Two, don't try to take over a house with a one-person majority with a group of sociopathic criminals in leadership. It's another for my book. It's another rule for everyone in politics. But frankly, I believe history will show that David Patterson created that problem and put those people into power. And so that completely shifted what did happen for that very brief period in power. But we're back, and we are far stronger. And I think we're going to show ourselves to be ready, willing, and able to take on challenges and push the envelope in the budget process in our future years. I sort of see this as our, we all got in January. We immediately had to deal with the budget. We have 15 new Democratic senators. And so that's a huge number of new people getting, their feet wet and learning their skills. And it takes a while to learn your skills. I just want to make sure I highlight anything else that I wanted to make sure. Transparency, Independent Budget Office, July 1st budget. And I really do think it's very important for us not to forget what I think Richard was continually trying to get us back to. You should never support decreasing the powers and constitutional authority of the legislature by shifting everything into one budget document, even if it's 9 different bills that often get rammed down people's throats in the middle of the night because of perhaps this artificial terror about if we're late, what happens. But we've built that into our psyche now. And so we have to be very, very careful for the sake of democracy that we don't let that become the sort of the model of all government in New York State, because I think we will be very sorry. I suppose particularly if we had Carl Palladino as the governor, yes, but there's any other number of people that either party could realize would be truly disastrous for that. So thank you very much for letting me have a few closing statements. Thank you. Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for being here. We're getting you out on time, and we thank you again for attending, and the discussion, I'm sure, will continue on and on. Thank you, Liz, for moderating also.
No problem.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks, EJ.